thought that what might be interesting to do would be to split the discussion into two parts, really. Communists have traditionally regarded Trotskyism as a variety of ultra-leftism, or left-wing communism, as Lenin called it. So I thought it might be interesting to split it up into two parts. One where we first of all discuss the symptoms of the infantile disorder of left-wing communism, the characteristics of ultra-leftism in general. And then secondly, to look at some of the specific characteristics of Trotskyism, which differentiate it from maybe other kinds of Marxism or other kinds of ultra-leftism, or however you want to put it. Now, Lenin's book Left-Wing Communism and Infantile Disorder is one of the classics of Lenin's writings. It was written at a time when the communist movement itself was very young. It was written about 1920. The Communist International had just been formed. The Communist parties themselves were in the process of formation. The British Communist Party was still in the process of unification. And one of Lenin's points about why he wrote and devoted so much time to this was because he felt that there were specific lessons from the Bolshevik Party that they had learned in their struggle to lead a successful revolution, build a successful revolutionary party, where they had to fight not just against their opponents on the right, but they had also to wage an ideological battle against their opponents on the left, and sometimes also within the Bolshevik Party itself. And he argued really that the Bolsheviks had succeeded because of three virtues. He said that one of the reasons they'd won was because they were a very disciplined and self-disciplined party, that while they were building a vanguard party, a leadership party, they also maintained the closest possible contact with working people. And he made the point, which he stressed very much, not just the working class, but also what he called the non-proletarian masses. And in Russia, of course, that meant primarily the peasantry and the poor peasantry. But that was a very important point. A vanguard without a mass following is not a vanguard. And thirdly, that they had managed to convince the masses of people through their own experience of the correctness of Bolshevik strategy and tactics. It was a matter of people learning through experience, not by being lectured to. So he argued those were three prime characteristics of the successful revolutionary party. Whereas on the contrary, this left-wing communism was characterised by a lack of organisation, a lack of discipline, a lack of determination, a lack of perseverance. It was also characterised by a tendency to move from one extreme to another, to go from kind of euphoria about revolution to despair, from hyperactivism to very abstract and very passive propaganda. And he also emphasised that all revolutionary movements often encountered old mistakes in new and unfamiliar guises. And it was something which, I remember when I first read Left-Wing Communism and Infantile Disorder, I thought, well, Lenin clearly was a little bit optimistic in imagining it was an infantile disorder, because problems of sectarianism and left opportunism constantly cropped up decades after Lenin had written the book. But it occurred to me when I was doing a meeting for the YCL in London, Lenin makes another very important point. He talks about how every generation comes to socialism in its own way, and has to find its own path to socialism. And I suppose it's very much like an infantile disorder. It's like the mumps and the measles or the flu. Kids get all sorts of diseases and they shake them off. But every new generation gets a different dose of them. The viruses mutate. And in a sense, that's a little bit like ultra-leftism. It reappears in different forms. Certain general characteristics can be identified, but there's always a new and something different about it every time it reappears in different ways. For example, when Lenin was writing the book in 1920, the very early communist movement was constructed out of all sorts of very disparate political movements. One very important influence was the anarchist movement and the anarcho-syndicalist movement. That had a tremendous influence in many working class parties in Europe and in North America, and many anarchists and anarcho-syndicalists moved across to the communist parties in the early years because of the influence of the Russian Revolution. And obviously they did so by bringing with them all sorts of habits and ideas that belong to this pre-communist movement. So if you read Left-Wing Communism, you'll find him arguing very, very strongly against the remnants of anarchism and anarchist ideas, which were very, as I said, very important, because they actually had a basis not just amongst intellectuals, but among very militant sections of the working class in particular countries. And actually the experience of the Russian Revolution was one of the things which really killed off anarchism as a mass working class movement, with the exception probably of Spain, where it continued until the 1930s or so. So one of the features of the Russian Revolution was, ironically, to ensure that the new strains of ultra-leftism that appeared would be ones which were very much linked to Marxism and indeed to Leninism. And the ultra-left always presents itself as being the true Bolsheviks, the true Leninists. Obviously, the background to this particular discussion has been, I think, the splits and the crisis within the SSP, and clearly the discussion that we're having here isn't just a purely theoretical one. But it struck me that when Lenin was writing Left-Wing Communism, he was trying to convince people like Willy Gallagher, for example, of the importance of taking part in parliamentary struggles and standing in elections and working in the Labour Party and so on. I mean, it's quite amazing to come back to Scotland and see the SSP ripping itself apart. And one of the characteristics of the split clearly is not a revulsion about parliamentary work, it's an obsession with it. You can see the amazing impact of their electoral work and their parliamentary positions has been a major factor in the reason why the split has happened at this particular time. As people are jostling around to get their positions on the party lists for next year and to try and form themselves into an electoral machine. And in fact, if you read some of the statements by both sides, it's amazing the extent to which the electoral struggle now has taken quite a central position in the SSP's and Solidarity's political perspective. I mean, I was looking at the expenses lists for the MSPs that was published, I think, just the other week, and you can see that there's quite a lot of money there for the SSP. For a small party, they're using parliamentary money to support their party structure, which is quite genuine and obviously necessary, and communists would do pretty much the same. But it can lead, with a very young party and what's effectively actually a very weak party in some senses, it can lead them to a great dependence on electoral and parliamentary forms of struggle. I don't think that's really something that would ever have occurred to Lenin when he was writing it in 1920. The options were completely different at that point. So it's important, I think, to look at the particular context of ultra-leftism. It's not something which is unchanging. It has particular characteristics depending on the national context and the historical context at any given moment. Now, one of I suppose you could say it's maybe not necessarily a characteristic, you could say maybe it is left-wing communism or ultra-leftism, is what we call left opportunism. The left opportunism, or any kind of opportunism, is really a get-rich-quick strategy, a movement to take advantage of some apparently immediate possibility for a very, very rapid advance, jumping on and off bandwagons, which is something which is very characteristic of the ultra-left. I noticed that when Sheridan announced his new party, within a matter of days, the Socialist Workers' Party and the Committee for the Workers' International immediately announced their support for Sheridan. Yet, south of the border in England, the Socialist Workers' Party is involved in a coalition called Respect. And there's obviously questions about what or when Respect will appear in Scotland. And yet the Committee for the Workers' International was involved in a completely different rival setup called the Campaign for a New Workers' Party. So these groups, which are very happy to work together in Scotland, but they can't find any basis for working together in England. They've involved themselves in parties which are, by definition, which are separatist parties, which are parties campaigning for an independent Scotland, despite the fact that neither the SWP or the Committee for the Workers' International really support independence. It's a purely tactical thing. I dug out this document from the early 90s, and this is the Committee for the Workers' International, and it said, "We support the right to self-determination, ultimately separation, if the overwhelming majority are in favour of it." Well, actually, that's the CPB's position as well. We would accept a democratic decision. However, we do not advocate separation. Again, that's pretty much the party's position. We're in favour of a socialist Britain or a socialist federation of the British Isles, which I think is a little bit dodgier. We're implacably opposed to nationalism and are against the splitting of the labour movement on nationalist lines. And in the same document, this is 1991, it said, if the SNP developed a significant working class membership, obviously we would send people in. Now this, of course, was the old militant tendency, which was breaking out of the Labour Party and talking quite openly about the possibility of engaging in entryism within, not just, they'd given up on the Labour Party, they were looking for something else to go in. The SNP, certainly not a working class party, that was a possibility. As it happened, they effectively formed their own party, Scottish Militant Labour, and ultimately the SSP. So it gives a flavour of the kind of opportunism that's the, as I said, it's get rich quick. It's not a question of the principled fight for a political position, because they don't actually believe in advocating separation, but they're quite happy to join. In fact, they're happy to leap from one separatist party to another on the basis that they may have greater influence, greater control over one rather than another. They may recruit more members, they might sell more newspapers. It's quite as simple as that. Now, one of the underlying issues of ultra-leftism is what we might call determinism or fatalism, and volunteerism on the other hand. Marx famously said that the philosophy of revolutionary change was based on the idea that men make their own history, but they don't do so in circumstances of their own choosing. In other words, human beings are capable of shaping history, they're capable of making history, but they also inherit a history that's gone before them, and that will determine the limits of change which are possible at any moment in time. And there's all sorts of factors, cultural factors, social factors, the level of economic development, all sorts of objective factors which people have to take into account in order to achieve a revolutionary change. There has to be a kind of synchronisation of the consciousness, class consciousness on the one hand, but also an appreciation of the limits of change and the possibilities for change on the other. It's a question of balancing up the subjective factor and the objective factor. Now, in 1938, Trotsky drafted the transitional programme, which was basically the founding document of the Fourth International. He starts off with a very sweeping generalisation about the objective factor. He said, the economic prerequisite for the proletarian revolution has already in general achieved the highest point of fruition that can be reached under capitalism. Mankind's productive forces stagnate. Already new inventions and improvements fail to raise the level of material wealth. Now, of course, in the 1930s that might seem to be a reasonable statement, although it was still wrong. But certainly historically it's completely incorrect. Capitalism simply hadn't stopped, it hadn't reached a point of no further growth. And that leads to any number of other mistaken conclusions. But its fundamental premise was entirely incorrect. Clearly capitalism has had the ability to develop productive forces, although in a particular way, but certainly productive forces have not stagnated since 1938. We're not living in anything like the same material level. And of course that has one very obvious factor, which is his belief that if capitalism had exhausted its potential, then reformism, and he included the communist parties as being reformist, then reformism had really exhausted itself as well, because there was no potential really to make any substantial kinds of reforms or advances in terms of living standards for working people, or to make any real substantial advance in the political level either. He then went on to say, and talking about the subjective factor, the economy, the state, the politics of the bourgeoisie and its international relations are completely blighted by a social crisis, characteristic of a pre-revolutionary state of society. The chief obstacle in the path of transforming the pre-revolutionary into a revolutionary state is the opportunist character of proletarian leadership. In other words, the reason that there hasn't been a revolution is purely because the leadership of the working class, whether it's socialist or communist, are deliberately holding back the struggle. It's purely the subjective factor, the opportunist character of proletarian leadership. And you can see that the two things are clearly connected. On the one hand, there's a very deterministic argument about the development of the capitalist economy, and on the other hand, a very voluntarist element where the focus is on the human will, it's on human consciousness, purely on the subjective factor, The two are very closely connected. The two extremes actually meet in a sense. Dogmatism is also another characteristic of ultra-leftism. It's one which communists are prone to as much as anybody else. Lenin was very fond of a phrase. He talked about the concrete analysis of the concrete situation. This was a means of applying Marxism to actual development, not simply repeating formulas or cliches, but actually analysing in a very concrete manner the actual development of politics and economics. I'll give you an example of what I mean by dogmatism. The dogmatists basically often take something which is correct in a particular context and they apply it in every other context as well. They approach class struggle as something which is very abstract, and they basically take these abstract truths out of their historical, geographical context. Class struggle in reality takes place in specific times, specific locations. They've always got historical and they've always got a geographical context to them. Now, one of a very small Trotskyist group, you might not come across them very much, but they're call themselves the Communist League. They sell a newspaper called The Militant, an American newspaper, and they sell books, usually a lot of books on Cuba, Pathfinder Press, and so on. Now, they're a group which was tied to an American party, the American Socialist Workers' Party, which is not to be confused with our own. The American Socialist Workers' Party was at one time probably the most important Trotskyist party in the world, you could say. Certainly one of the most influential. And it held two related dogmas of the Trotskyist movement. One is that the communist parties were counter-revolutionary, and two, that you couldn't build socialism in one country. And what they did with this particular dogma is they were faced in 1949 with the Chinese Revolution. And it took them 6 years for them to actually accept formally that there had indeed been a revolution in China. It wasn't until 1955 that they went, yeah, okay, probably has been a revolution. Because it challenged the dogmas. It challenged the dogma of counter-revolutionary communists, and it challenged the dogma of socialism in one country. A couple of years later, there was a revolution which broke out in Cuba. Now, the Cuban Revolution wasn't led by the traditional Cuban Communist Party, and the American SWP therefore embraced it, thinking that it was a much healthier example of socialist revolution, which is why they sell all the Fidel Castro books and Che Guevara books on their stands. And they argued that Cuba was really after the revolution of 1917. The Cuban Revolution was the purest, best example of a healthy revolution. Now, after 1989, when the Soviet Union and the socialist countries in Europe collapsed, the SWP, the American SWP, were forced to confront another problem, which was how can Cuba survive if its allies have gone? This is a document that they published in 1995. Building socialism in one country has never been a possibility. The power of the Cuban Revolution would be quickly dissipated if it was the only post-capitalist state still standing. The continued existence of the worker states, even in their deformed and weakened condition, remains a strength and an aid to Cuba, which is correctly thought to be part of the dictatorship of the proletariat worldwide. Now, the continued existence of the worker states, you might think they're talking about China or Vietnam, but in fact, their leader went on to say, worker states still exist in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union. This is 1995. The dictatorship of the proletariat is not a concept, it's a historical fact. Overturning the worker states would open up the possibility of a massive expansion of capitalism in the world, enable the employing class to find a way out of the crisis. And very specifically, they actually came to the conclusion that not only did worker states continue to exist in the Soviet Union, the GDR, German Democratic Republic, East Germany, it also still existed. Said, rather than overturning the worker states in Eastern Germany by taking on the working class in battle, the resolution of all major questions keeps being postponed. Social relations haven't been reversed in Eastern Germany. That is the heart of what a worker state is. Now, they were probably the only group in the world who actually believed that the GDR still existed in 1995. It would have been a great idea if it did exist. But you can see that in order to hang on to their dogma, they simply denied reality. And as far as I know, that's still the position. It would be worth asking them the next time you see them. But you can see that dogmatism actually paves the way for revisionism, because quite clearly there was no state, no socialist state on German soil in 1995. It's simply not possible to argue that. What they then do is they end up having to avoid very, very basic questions of class power and state power and so on, in order to continue to cling to dogmas. And that's a very extreme example, but it is definitely one of my favourites. Sectarianism is also another very obvious feature of ultra-leftism, and it has an obvious link with dogmatism, because it's by maintaining a focus on some small theoretical dispute or what have you, the organisations often maintain the need for their separation from each other. And certainly when you look at the ultra-left, it becomes very puzzling to understand why groups which maybe to us seem very, very close are nonetheless very, very antagonistic to each other. Sectarians and left sectarianism really is ignoring the point that Lenin made about the need to be in close contact with the masses. The sectarians would much rather be correct, pure, and completely detached from the mass movements. It's more important for them to be separate and pure and uncontaminated than it is to actually to lead mass movements. And I'm sure you can think of many examples of sectarianism. The ones that I kind of came up with were such things as setting up rival solidarity movements, things like Hands Off Venezuela, which is set up by the Socialist Appeal Group, rather than building a much broader based organisation in solidarity. You can think of groups like, I don't know, Fight Racism, Fight Imperialism, still knocking around, but they are, right. Those kind of groups who set up their own pro-Cuba groups, when in fact there's a perfectly supportable broader campaign. So that's really an example of sectarianism at work. Now, I mentioned earlier that one of the currents within the communist movement in the early years was anarcho-syndicalism, which was a tendency to be very militant in terms of the economic struggles of the working class, in terms of trade unions and strikes and so on. And this was certainly a factor in the development of the communist movement in the early years. Lenin was very critical of what he called economism. This was a tendency to concentrate only on economic issues, trade union issues. This tendency, this economism, had emerged very early on in the Russian working class movement. On the one hand, it seemed to be a very progressive thing because it was encouraging the development of working class organisation. But in fact, what it did was it turned the working class into almost a electoral fodder for capitalist parties. It left the field of political struggle open to the capitalist class and their representatives. And economism was often quite a right-wing tendency because it left the struggle against Tsarism open only to the liberal capitalist political currents, rather than fighting for a working class political leadership. Lenin had come into contact with this very, very early on. The Bolshevik Party was really formed in response to the struggle against this tendency to focus only on wages and conditions and factories and so on, and rather than taking up the much broader political struggle, the struggle for democracy, in other words. And syndicalism was really a kind of revolutionary, it was a left-wing variety of this. It talked a lot about the overthrow of capitalism, it talked a lot about strikes and so on, but there was an unwillingness to take the political struggle beyond the confines of the factories and the plants and so on. Lenin felt that this was a major mistake because it allowed the reformist parties within the working class to continue to dominate the political arena, and he argued that it was important to view the class struggle as a political struggle, not just as an economic struggle. It wasn't a matter simply of supporting workers against their bosses in the factory and then leaving the political arena completely open. You had to confront the capitalist class as a ruling class, and that meant a political struggle. As I said, that was a factor which very, very early on was very important in forging the communist parties. It was an important battle against ultra-leftism within the communist movement. There's another, this doesn't trip off the tongue very easily, but there's another form of ultra-leftism which I think is quite an important one, which is what Lenin called imperialist economism. During the First World War, Lenin was beginning to really clarify his own ideas on what imperialism was about. And he was also clarifying his ideas about the importance of supporting the right of nations to self-determination. He saw these two things as being very, very closely interconnected. And if you read what Lenin was writing about before the Russian Revolution of 1917, if you read what he was writing in, say, 1915, 1916, a huge amount of it is about imperialism, and it's about the right of nations to self-determination. The reason he was devoting so much time to it is because in the middle of this great conflict, this First World War, which was engulfing Europe, a number of revolutionary Marxists were arguing that it was no longer important to really support national self-determination, because the crisis of imperialism was global, and it was so acute that the question of supporting a secession or separation of a country was really almost a diversion. It was almost irrelevant to this great class battle. And he likened this approach, which was taken by some very great revolutionary thinkers, people like Rosa Luxemburg and others, who came close to these kinds of positions, but also a tendency within the Bolshevik Party itself. He likened this to the Economist. He said, it's not enough to talk about great battles against imperialism, as if you're going to have one army lining up saying we're for socialism, and you get another army lining up saying we're for imperialism. It was important for revolutionaries to fight imperialism on all fronts, and that meant precisely by taking up the struggle for democracy and supporting the right of nations to self-determination, and those countries and territories which were oppressed by imperialist states had a perfect right to break away, and revolutionaries in the oppressor countries had a duty to support that. This is, I think, a very important issue, because the national question remains one of the most difficult, one of the most fluid questions in the world today, and there are still those people who will belittle or regard as unimportant the struggle of small countries or oppressed countries in the developing world against imperialism, and you see that as something which is almost a diversion. What we should all really be doing is fighting for socialism and fighting for world federations of socialist states or United Socialist States of Europe and so on. The problem with it is it belittles the struggle for democracy. The struggle for democracy, Lenin argued, was the fastest path to the struggle for socialism, and imperialism is inherently undemocratic, not just in the imperialist countries, but obviously in their relations with the countries which they oppress. So the struggle for democracy is really twofold, but it is ultimately a struggle, a class struggle against imperialism, and it's the surest way, the easiest way to move forward in the struggle against imperialism. As I said, those are just some of the characteristics, I think, which we might be quite familiar with, and I'm sure you can think of many different examples, but roughly speaking, those are kind of the essential characteristics: dogmatism, sectarianism, and so on. These are key characteristics of ultra-leftism, but they are by no means restricted to the Trotskyist movement, unfortunately. They appear in many different guises. They appear within the communist movement in various ways at various times, and some discussion, I think, of that is perhaps helpful to us.